Washington, D.C. mornings are usually crowded and rushed, but on this morning the rain was falling slowly, people were walking quieter, the city seemed to be breathing a little more carefully. A vintage hearse stopped on a street signaled that something was out of the ordinary. The back door of a small church was open. There were only 9 people inside. The coffin was plain and dark blue. There were no flowers, names, or crosses on it, just a bare wooden surface. At that moment, someone quietly entered the door. He had turned up the collar of his jacket. He was wearing a hat. The guard with him stood just outside the door. He entered alone. Even the church official did not seem to recognize him, but one of the 9 people inside began to squint. He stood up slowly. He nodded without saying anything. Because it was Barack Obama. No television, no reporters were there. This was not a public event. It was a farewell ceremony in one-way silence. The man in the coffin was officially named Leonard J. Brooks, but no one in town knew him by that name. Everyone just called him Lenny. He was a man seen on street corners for years, constantly reading books, never hurting anyone, but never really known. He was homeless, but he had stayed in some places longer than his hosts, especially in the old stone library at 3rd and H Street. Obama sat in the back row at the funeral. He didn't take his eyes off the coffin. He didn't speak. He didn't intervene. He just listened. The man in the front row was a man who wasn't a priest but sounded like he had been giving speeches for centuries. He didn't mention Lenny's death. He just talked about trying to live. Some people are visible but not noticed. Some people are silent but tell more. Lenny, every year he was silent, he actually listened to us. And finally, we were silent. He was gone. Obama's eyes dropped to the floor. His bodyguard, standing next to him, turned his eyes away. The silence had turned into respect. No one hugged each other as the coffin was carried out at the end of the ceremony. No one took pictures. The coffin was placed on the dirt road, wet with raindrops. A light mist had settled on the grass. At that moment, Obama walked forward slowly. No one said, "Come in." This was his domain anyway. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a small, worn notebook. He tore out a single page and took it out, and silently placed it on the coffin. No one could see what was written on this piece of paper. But then, an old woman, her eyes filled with tears, began to cry. Only she had seen it, and only he had cried. 2 days later, a small piece appeared in the local newspaper. Former President Obama attends funeral of homeless man. No one knew the details. There was no family. There were no records. There were no questions. There was just silence. And that silence echoed off the damp sidewalks of Washington. But a few days later, a man appeared. His name was Cliff Hendricks. He was one of the city's former street archivists. He was retired. But something caught his attention. On a microfilm copy printed in 1987, a temporary staff roster at the library on 3rd and H Street read, "Leonard J. Brooks, Catalog Assistant, 1 year." That was Lenny. And years ago, Obama used to go to the same library before he went to Harvard as a young political science major. What if these two met on a bookshelf years ago? Cliff Hendricks's apartment was filled with old newspapers and library receipts, as befits an archivist. The walls were covered with boxes of microfilm and a shelving system. For years, no one on the street had taken Lenny's name seriously, but to Cliff, he was the forgotten interlude of the system. In September 1987, he had been selected from the city's temporary staff pool and assigned to the Washington Library at 3rd and H Streets. His job was to rearrange the bookshelves and retype lost catalog cards by hand. The information seemed ordinary, until Cliff saw this handwritten note in an old catalog file. The history shelf was 3D recoded. A young man came in. His question was interesting. Do you think leadership is about whose voices we let in or who we don't hear? There was no signature, but there was a small L drawn in pencil in the margin of the note. Cliff had seen the note for years, but he never took it seriously until he heard that Obama had attended the funeral. Cliff immediately took the note. There was a date on the back, November 15th, 1987. And interestingly enough, Obama had spent a short time in D.C. before going to Harvard that very year. He had been in the city at the end of the summer to apply for a scholarship. According to records, he had worked in Washington for a while after graduating from Columbia. He was even known to have volunteered for a number of NGOs, so it was possible that he had been at that library on that date. Cliff put this information together and reached out to Anna Bensley. Anna was the journalist who had written the Raymond Keller story years earlier and was known for her reporting that revealed the hidden connections between Obama and people on the street. Anna's eyes widened when she saw the document Cliff had brought, because this wasn't just a random note, it was proof of direct contact. The next morning, Anna went to the library and looked at the shelves where Lenny had once worked. The 3B shelf was still there, but it had been refurbished. When she spoke to the librarians, she learned that there was a storage area in the back that had still been untouched. It had been closed off after the shelving system was digitized in 1990. Anna got special permission to go down there. When the door opened, it seemed almost out of time. Dust, rust, the bent iron of old shelves. But in one corner, a yellow box caught her attention. It said, "Staff Notes, 1987. Dozens of notebooks, notepapers, and small cards were found inside, and among them was a torn-edged planner page. In the middle of the leaf was written in handwriting, B.O., November 3rd, 1987. The young man came back. He sat down among the shelves. I wanted to recommend a book to him, but he was only looking for one. Shadows of Strangers. I didn't know of such a book." Anna was struck by the name, Shadows of Strangers. Was there really no such book? She looked in the catalog system. No record came up. But a few minutes later, she saw a phrase that was not loaded into the digital database but only as an internal reference. Catalog shadow entry, GZ-19-X. Subject, History of Anonymity. The catalog's notes included the following sentence: uncertain identities, transient people, silent witnesses. For Anna, this was no longer just a homeless man's funeral, it was the missing part of a story. Obama and Lenny. They had actually met in 1987 in a library hallway, silently. And Lenny had spoken to Obama at a time when he had not yet attracted the attention of any cameras. To dig deeper, Anna contacted one of Obama's former advisors, David Axelrod. He was one of the few people who knew the stories outside the cameras. At first, he didn't want to talk, but when he saw Anna's research, he made a short sentence. Barack always looked at the people in the back rows more, because there was no sound there, but there were eyes. No one had the note left on the coffin on the day of the funeral, no pictures had been taken, and no one had said what the piece of paper was. Only an old woman had seen it. Anna began looking for the woman. 6 of the 9 people who had attended the funeral were unreachable, but one was a former social worker, Marla Jenkins. Marla had known Lenny well for years. She hadn't recognized him on the street but among the shelves, and she had realized as soon as she entered that the person who had come to the funeral was Obama. Anna asked, "What did the note say?" "Did you see it?" Marla answered without hesitation. It was a very short sentence. It just said, "I remember what you said. Now it's my turn." Anna closed the notebook. All the pieces were falling into place. Years later, Obama had carried not just an election victory, he had also carried the word of a silent dialogue. Lenny's name would not go down in history, but the silent conversation with him had set the internal rhythm of a leader. A note left on a man's grave can sometimes say more than a flower, especially when the person who left that note had once sat in the most powerful seat in the world. That morning, Anna prepared to go back to Lenny's grave. She had only her notebook, her tape recorder, and a small cardboard box with her. In the box was a replica of the paper that had not been recorded on the day of the funeral but had been recorded by eye. She had rewritten the sentence Marla remembered in her own handwriting. "I remember what you said. Now it's my turn." This was not just a farewell. It was an acknowledgement of a testimony, and it was the last line of a dialogue that had begun years ago on a shelf where she thought no one would watch. Lenny's grave was silent. There was still no headstone, just a small wooden plaque and dirt. But Anna knew some names live on people, not stones. She fell silent for the first time, standing there at the grave. She didn't press record. She didn't take notes. She just rested her hands on the edge of the box and waited silently for a while. Then she opened the box, took out the note, and placed it back on the grave. The wind gently waved the note, and then Anna realized something. Some words were heard better when they were whispered. Weeks later, the Washington Post published a short column. The headline was, "New details emerge from the anonymous funeral Obama attended." It was a short, unpolitical account written by Anna herself. There was no accusation in that account, no heroism. It was just a quiet story about one man responding to another man's silence. The comments were mixed. Beautiful but unimportant, some said. Others wrote, "We need more quiet stories like this these days." But the important thing wasn't the comments, it was the echo. Because a week later, a short statement came from Obama's official office. Just one sentence. "The invisible people are the most remembered because their silence has become the voice of others." With this sentence, the White House archives made a section of the private visit list from 1987 public. That list included the following entry: November 15, 1987, Barack Obama, 3rd and H Street. Washington Library. A note was written next to it. Reference section, book request, leadership among the unidentified. Anna knew now that everything she had been looking for had been confirmed, but the story did not end there. Because a few days later, she received a call from the shelter where Lenny had donated his old belongings. The center employee said that a small box had been kept in his name and should not be given to anyone else. The box read, "If anyone is going to truly remember me, that's enough." Anna took the box. Inside was an old diary, some newspaper clippings, and a tape. The date on the tape was November 17, 1987, and the only note, B.O. came. He didn't speak for a long time, but the last thing he said was, "Someday someone will try to silence me, but when I'm silent, I'll remember you." Anna put the tape into an old tape recorder. After a crackling silence, Lenny's voice came, faint but clear. "Not everyone who comes to the library buys a book. Some people just wait, but he didn't wait. He heard. And for the first time, I felt like someone really heard me." Years later, Lenny's headstone was finally placed, a simple stone of white marble. On it was written only one sentence, "I remember what you said." There was no signature on the bottom, but everyone standing there knew whose signature it was.